The perfect fit. By the third interview, Elias already knew he wasn't getting the job. Nobody had said it directly. In fact, every conversation had sounded positive. "We love your experience. You're clearly qualified. You've done impressive work. We just want to make sure the fit is right." But Elias had been in operations long enough to recognize the tone shift that happened when hiring managers stopped evaluating skills and started evaluating comfort. Skill was a checklist. Comfort was a mirror. And he had stopped looking like the people staring into it about 10 minutes into the second interview. The company was called Brightloop, a fast-growing tech startup that sold AI workflow tools to hospitals. Their careers page talked endlessly about innovation, authenticity, and disrupting the future of healthcare. Their About page featured a black and white photo of the founders barefoot on a beach, allegedly brainstorming the company's mission statement. Elias had read it twice and still couldn't tell what the company actually did before 9 in the morning. The office looked exactly how he imagined. Exposed brick walls, cold brew on tap, a neon sign in the lobby that said, "Be bold" in lowercase script. Employees wearing sneakers worth more than his first monthly car payment. A ping pong table no one was playing on, but somehow everyone walked around with reverence. Everyone looked relaxed in the carefully rehearsed way professionals practiced being relaxed. Elias arrived 10 minutes early for the final panel interview. At 43, he was older than most startup applicants. Not old, just old enough to remember offices before every company tried to look like a social club. Old enough to have worked through 2 recessions, 3 reorganizations, and 1 CEO who got walked out by HR on a Tuesday afternoon. He wore a navy suit. Not because he misunderstood startup culture, because he believed interviews still mattered. The receptionist, who looked roughly 23 and wore a hoodie with the company logo printed sideways, smiled politely. "Oh, you can have a seat. The team's wrapping up lunch." Her eyes drifted, just briefly, to his tie. From the waiting area, Elias could hear laughter from the kitchen. A loud voice shouted, "Bro, if we survive this quarter, we're doing Tokyo." Another voice answered, "Dude, I'm bringing the drone this time." More laughter followed. Elias opened his portfolio and reviewed his notes, the way he had reviewed notes before every important meeting for the last 15 years. 15 years in operations leadership, built 2 departments from scratch, reduced employee turnover by 30% at his previous company, managed crisis rollouts during the pandemic while competitors collapsed under pressure, mentored 4 direct reports into director-level roles, survived an acquisition without losing a single team member. The role itself, Director of Client Operations, was almost perfectly aligned with his background. The job description read like someone had copied his resume and changed the font. Then the interview panel arrived. 3 people. Tyler, the VP of Operations, who wore a fitted gray t-shirt and had the kind of tan that suggested either Aspen or a very honest tanning bed. Emma from HR, who carried a notebook with a small embroidered cactus on the cover and apologized twice for being 30 seconds late. And Jake, the 28-year-old product lead, who somehow looked both exhausted and overconfident at the same time. The kind of confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong about anything yet. Tyler stuck out a hand and gave a grip that was somehow too firm and too brief at the same time. "Hey man, glad you could come in." Man, not Elias, not Mr. Reyes. Man. Elias smiled and shook the hand anyway. The interview started well. Elias spoke clearly, professionally, and directly. He answered operational questions with examples instead of buzzwords. When they asked about conflict resolution, he described handling a hospital client threatening to terminate a 7-figure contract over a botched data migration. He walked them through how he kept the relationship intact, replaced the implementation lead, and renegotiated the SLA into something cleaner than the original. When they asked about scaling teams, he broke down hiring systems, onboarding metrics, accountability structures, and retention planning. He mentioned a framework he had developed for measuring whether new hires were genuinely productive at 60 days versus simply present. When they asked about failure, he gave them a real one, a project he had championed 3 years ago that had cost his old company close to $400,000 before he killed it. He explained what he had missed, what he had learned, and what he now did differently. Tyler nodded constantly. Emma took notes. Jake mostly watched, occasionally checking his phone under the table in a way he probably thought was subtle. For about 20 minutes, it felt like a real conversation. Then came the shift. It always came eventually. Tyler leaned back in his chair, stretched, and let his hands fall behind his head. So, culture here is really important to us. Elias smiled politely. Of course. We're very collaborative, Emma added. High energy, Jake said, as if the phrase itself were a credential. Tyler laughed. Yeah, we work hard, but we're kind of like a family, too. Elias had heard that phrase 1,000 times. Sometimes it meant supportive. Sometimes it meant boundaries disappeared. Sometimes it meant the founder yelled at people on Slack at 11 on a Sunday night and called it passion. Sometimes it meant we hire people we'd grab drinks with. Jake leaned forward. What do you usually do outside of work? Elias paused. It wasn't technically an illegal question, but it rarely had anything to do with performance. I spend a lot of time with my kids, Elias answered, and honestly, I read quite a bit, mostly business history and organizational psychology. I'm in the middle of a book about how Toyota built their management system in the 50s. A small silence followed. Jake nodded slowly. Nice. The word came out the way people said interesting about a painting they didn't like. Tyler jumped back in. We do a lot together as a team. Retreats, late nights, game nights, that kind of thing. Last quarter, the whole company went to Joshua Tree and did this whole desert experience thing. Elias smiled again. I'm always happy to collaborate professionally with the team. Professionally. The word landed awkwardly in the room. Not hostile, just different. Like someone speaking formal English at a backyard barbecue. Emma glanced toward Tyler. Jake leaned farther back in his chair, his face arranging itself into the polite neutrality people wore when they had already made up their minds and were now just running out the clock. Elias could feel it happening in real time now. Not rejection based on competence, rejection based on atmosphere. He wasn't failing the interview, he was failing the vibe. The rest of the meeting became strangely abstract. Questions about energy, questions about personality, questions about how people would describe your style. Jake asked, with the air of a man asking something profound, what Elias's spirit animal would be in a crisis. Elias said a sheepdog. Jake said, and wrote something down. Elias answered everything calmly, but he already understood the outcome. There was nothing he could say in the next 10 minutes that would change a decision that had been made somewhere around the word professionally. Tyler walked him out. Really great meeting you, man. We'll be in touch by end of week. Elias thanked him, shook the too brief hand again, and stepped out into the parking lot. The sun was sharp. His tie suddenly felt heavy. He sat in his car for a minute before starting it. Not upset, just doing the math. 2 days later, the rejection email arrived. While your qualifications are impressive, we decided to move forward with a candidate who more closely aligns with the collaborative and cultural environment at Bright Loop. We were genuinely inspired by your experience and hope to stay in touch as we continue to grow. Elias stared at the screen. No explanation, no measurable deficiency, no feedback he could improve from. Just culture. He read it twice, closed the laptop, and made himself a coffee. 3 weeks later, a recruiter friend named Marcus called him. You hear who got the Bright Loop role? No. Tyler's friend from his old startup, guy named Connor, 29. Elias laughed softly. Of course. Guy has half your experience. They created the second director slot for him. Second? Yeah, apparently after they interviewed you, they decided they actually needed 2 directors. Funny how that math works. Elias wasn't even angry anymore, just tired. Marcus hesitated before speaking again. Honestly, man, between us, they probably thought you were too corporate. Elias looked around his apartment. Bills on the counter, his son's backpack near the hallway, a calendar reminder for the mortgage payment due Friday, a framed photo of his daughter holding up a science fair ribbon from 2 years ago. Too corporate. 15 years of experience reduced to a personality mismatch. Not because he lacked skill, not because he couldn't lead, not because he had ever failed to deliver, but because he didn't mirror the social identity of the people already inside the room. Because his suit was a sentence written in a grammar they no longer spoke. Because he had said professionally instead of stoked. He thought about Connor for a moment. 29. Tyler's friend, a guy who probably had a stand-up paddleboard in his garage and an opinion about espresso machines. Elias hoped he was good at the job. He suspected he wasn't. The next month was harder than he wanted to admit. He had 6 interviews lined up before the rejection, and 4 of them ended in some version of the same sentence. Great experience. Not quite the right fit. We're looking for someone with more energy, someone hungrier, someone who would, presumably, do shots with the founder at the holiday party. Energy, he had come to understand, often just meant young. Hungry often just meant cheap. Culture often just meant familiar. He didn't tell his wife how many polite rejections were stacking up. He told her things were moving. He told her there were good prospects. He took the kids to school each morning in a button-down shirt because he refused to spend a workday in sweatpants, even unemployed. Then, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, a different kind of email came in. Harborstone Medical Group. Recruiter referral. Older company. Family-owned for 41 years. They ran a network of outpatient clinics across 3 states and had recently lost their head of operations to retirement. Elias interviewed with them the following Monday. Smaller office in a low brick building off a service road. The lobby had a leather couch that had clearly been there since 2003 and a coffee maker that brewed exactly one kind of coffee. Older leadership team. Less flashy. The CEO, a woman named Diane in her late 50s, met him in a conference room with actual paper folders on the table. She asked him only 3 major questions. How do you solve operational problems? How do you manage burnout in your team and in yourself? How do you build trust on teams that have been let down before? She listened to every answer all the way through. She didn't interrupt. She didn't check her phone. When he finished a thought, there was a small pause before she spoke again, the kind of pause that signaled she was actually considering what he had said rather than waiting for her turn. No one asked about beer nights. No one asked if he snowboarded. No one asked if he felt like family. No one asked what his spirit animal was. At one point, Diane asked about his kids, not as a test, as a person. 2 days later, Elias received an offer. Higher salary than Bright Loop had offered, better benefits, remote flexibility, 2 days a week, a signing bonus that paid off the credit card he had been quietly carrying for 3 months. He accepted on a Thursday morning, sitting at the same kitchen table where he had read the Bright Loop rejection. 6 months into the role, employee turnover dropped dramatically under his leadership. Client retention improved. Revenue stabilized. 3 managers who had been mid-resignation when he arrived stayed. Employees who had been quietly burned out for years finally felt heard. He killed 2 meetings a week. He moved performance reviews to a quarterly cadence. He started a small program where new hires were paired with someone from a different department for their first 30 days, just to break the silos before they hardened. None of it was flashy. None of it would have gone viral on LinkedIn. But it worked. During a leadership meeting in October, Diane pulled him aside in the hallway. "You know why we hired you?" Elias smiled slightly. "Because I fit the culture?" Diane shook her head. "No, because you knew how to do the job." She said it the way someone said a thing they considered obvious. Then she walked back into the conference room and didn't bring it up again. Elias stood in the hallway for a moment longer. Somewhere on the other side of the country, a startup with exposed brick walls and a neon sign that said "Be Bold" was probably onboarding its third director of the year. Elias adjusted his tie. Then he went back to work.